Look at that wheelchair. Stop the car. Richard Bennett shouted as he lurched forward from his seat, his eyes fixed on the window. Turn around. Right now. The driver looked at him through the rearview mirror. Sir, this stretch of road is iced over. There are cars behind us. I said turn around, but your board meeting starts in 25 minutes. The meeting can wait. Stop the car. The driver didn't argue again. He switched on the turn signal, slowed down, and pulled the black SUV toward the curb. The tires crunched through a ridge of dirty, frozen snow. Richard unfastened his seatbelt. Sir, let me get out and check first. The door was already open. A blast of freezing wind struck Richard across the face. He stepped onto the icy pavement, his shoe slipping slightly beneath him. The moment he regained his balance, he hurried back toward the corner they had passed only moments earlier. Mr. Bennett. The driver quickly shut off the engine and ran after him. Richard didn't look back. He could see the wheelchair clearly now. One of the rear wheels had broken free from the axle and lay crooked in the gray snow beside the curb. The frame tilted heavily to one side, forcing the woman in the chair to grip the armrest to keep herself from falling. She was trembling, but it was the young woman beside her that made Richard slow down. Annie. She was kneeling in the snow, one knee nearly buried in the icy slush. A thin coat clung to her small frame, nowhere near enough to protect her from the bitter cold. She had positioned herself directly in the path of the wind, using her own body to shield her mother. With both hands, Annie pulled the worn gray blanket tightly around Sarah. She tucked the edges beneath her mother's legs, then took Sarah's freezing hands and pushed them back underneath the blanket. Mom, please don't take your hands out again. Annie's own teeth were chattering. Please, Mom, keep them under the blanket so they stay warm. Sarah looked at her daughter, her lips already pale. What about you? Annie quickly shook her head. I'm okay, Mom. You're shaking. I'm just a little cold. Annie, I really am okay. But her voice broke on the final word. Annie lowered her head and pretended to adjust the blanket around her mother's feet. Her hands were red and purple from the cold. Tiny cracks split the skin around her knuckles. The palm of her right glove had torn open, exposing skin that had gone almost white from the freezing air. Snow clung to her jeans from her knees down. She turned back toward the broken wheel. Both hands gripped the axle. She pushed. Nothing. Annie changed her angle and tried again. Please. She clenched her teeth and shoved with both hands. The wheel only twisted farther out of place. Annie stopped. Her shoulders shook violently. I'm sorry, Mom. Sarah looked down at her. Annie, I thought I could fix it. It's okay. It was making that noise yesterday. I heard it. She quickly wiped away her tears with the back of her freezing hand. I should have checked it more carefully before we left. You couldn't have known it would break, but I promised I'd get you to the center. Sarah reached out with a trembling hand and touched her daughter's cheek. You've already pushed me almost 3 kilometers. Annie bit her lip. We're so close. Sweetheart, look at me. Annie raised her eyes. Almost 3 kilometers in this cold. You've done enough. Annie shook her head as tears spilled down her cheeks. But if you miss therapy today, your legs will hurt more. Richard heard that and quickened his steps. Annie suddenly noticed the stranger approaching. She pushed herself upright. But one of her legs had gone numb from kneeling in the snow, and she nearly lost her balance. She grabbed the wheelchair handle and instinctively moved in front of Sarah. Richard stopped several feet away and raised both hands. Don't be afraid. I just want to help. Annie looked at him, then at the black SUV in the distance. Thank you, sir. Her voice had grown very small. Richard looked at Sarah. Is either of you hurt? No, sir. My mother is just very cold. Her wheelchair broke. Richard crouched to inspect it. The rear axle was bent, and the connecting joint had nearly separated from the frame. He tested it gently and immediately realized there was no way that wheelchair was going any farther. The driver arrived beside him. Sir, I've turned on the hazard lights. Richard pointed toward the chair. Call roadside assistance. Make it clear that we need a vehicle capable of transporting a damaged wheelchair. Yes, sir. Richard stood and immediately began taking off his heavy wool coat. Annie realized what he was doing. Sir, please, you don't have to. Richard draped the coat over Sarah. Annie quickly caught the edge of it. You'll be cold, sir. My mother already has a blanket. She's still shaking. But that's your coat. Richard pulled the collar higher around Sarah's shoulders. I have another coat. Then he looked at Annie. Your mother doesn't have another body to take this cold for her. Annie fell silent. She lowered her head and carefully smoothed the coat around her mother. "Thank you, sir." Sarah spoke softly too. "Thank you very much." Richard crouched until he was at eye level with her. "My name is Richard. What's yours?" "Sarah Carter." She looked toward her daughter. "This is Annie, my daughter." Richard turned to the young woman. "Annie, how long have the two of you been out here?" "About 15 minutes, sir." "Where were you going?" "East Side Community Rehabilitation Center, sir." Richard frowned. It was still a considerable distance away. "Do you live nearby?" "No, sir." Annie pointed back down the road. "We live near East 79th. Richard looked in that direction, then back at her. "That's almost 3 kilometers from here." Annie gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." "You pushed your mother all the way from home?" "Yes, sir." "In this weather?" Annie bent down and pulled the covering more securely around Sarah's legs. "It wasn't this cold when we left. I thought if I walked quickly enough, we could make it to her therapy appointment on time." Richard looked at the thin coat she was wearing. "You wore that the entire way?" Annie hesitated. "Yes, sir." "And the blanket?" Annie looked at her mother. "She needed it more than I did." Sarah immediately spoke up. "She insisted I take the whole thing. I told her we could share it. But she wouldn't." "Mum, you've been cold since we left home." Annie lowered her eyes. "I was walking, Mom. I was warmer than you." Richard said nothing for several seconds. Even the driver beside him turned his face away. Richard asked, "You don't have a car?" "No, sir." "What about the bus?" "There is a bus, but it's difficult with the wheelchair. When the snow gets heavy, the sidewalks between our apartment and the stop aren't always cleared. I'm afraid the wheels will get stuck." "Accessible transportation?" Annie pressed her lips together and gave a small shake of her head. "We asked about it, and using it regularly is a little more than I can afford." Richard understood the words she was trying so hard not to say. They didn't have the money. "How often does your mother have therapy?" "Whenever the center has a free appointment for her, I bring her." Richard studied her. "You push her almost 3 kilometers every time?" Annie looked slightly embarrassed. "Yes, sir. I'm used to it now." Sarah immediately turned toward her. "Used to it?" "She gets up at 5 every morning." "Mum." "She gets home late from work, sleeps a few hours, then gets up again to push me there." Annie gently squeezed her mother's hand. "Mom, please don't tell him all that." Sarah looked at Richard. "My legs became very weak after I got sick. The doctors said that if I keep up with therapy, there's still hope." The moment Annie heard the word hope, she grabbed onto it and refused to let go. Annie lowered her head. "I just want my mother to be able to walk a little again, sir." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "If she could just stand on her own someday, everything would be worth it." Richard looked at her cracked hands. Something tightened painfully inside his chest. He had seen these two before. Several times. Through the windows of his SUV, a mother in a wheelchair. A small young woman behind her. The blanket was always wrapped around the mother. The thin coat was always on the daughter. He had looked. He had wondered where they were going. Then, only seconds later, he had lowered his eyes to his phone again. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. Annie answered, "Almost 4 months, sir." Richard looked back down the long road behind them. Nearly 3 kilometers. One way, and then the girl still had to make the trip home. 4 months. Through Cleveland winter mornings, he turned back toward her. "Annie, how old are you?" 18, sir." Richard looked at her for a long moment. Every morning, this 18-year-old girl pushed her mother almost 3 kilometers because she couldn't afford a ride. The driver stepped closer. "Mr. Bennett, roadside assistance says it'll be at least 40 minutes. Richard looked at Sarah. Her trembling had grown worse. He made his decision immediately. "We're not waiting." Richard turned to Annie. "We're taking your mother to the hospital." Annie's eyes widened. "Sir, that really isn't necessary. She's too cold. The rehabilitation center isn't much farther. If you could just help us get there, that would already be more than enough." "Annie, your mother needs to be examined by a doctor." She went still, her hands clasped tightly together. "Sir, what is it?" Annie looked at her mother before finding the courage to answer. "We can't afford the emergency room." Richard looked at her. Now he understood. It wasn't that Annie didn't want help for her mother. She was afraid of the bill that would come afterward. "Don't worry about that." Annie quickly lowered her eyes. "I know you mean well, sir, and I'm truly grateful. But if the hospital runs a lot of tests, I'm afraid I won't be able to pay for them." "Annie," she looked up, "your mother is freezing. I'll take care of the cost." Annie stared at him as though she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. But sir, I can't let a stranger pay that much for us. Then don't think of me as a stranger. Richard pulled out his phone and handed it to the driver. Call the hospital. Tell them we're on our way. Then call my office. The driver asked, What about the board meeting, sir? Cancel it. The people from New York flew in just for this meeting. Richard looked at the 18-year-old girl still kneeling beside the broken wheelchair. Then they can fly back. Annie looked up at him. Perhaps only then did she begin to realize that the man standing in front of her was more than just a wealthy passerby. Richard turned toward her. My name is Richard Bennett. Annie gave a small nod. Yes, sir, I'm Annie Carter. I know. Your mother already introduced you. A tiny smile appeared on Annie's pale, cold face. Yes, sir, I forgot. Richard stood. Now let's get your mother into the car. Annie immediately looked at the wheelchair. Sir, what about this? My people will take it with us. Please don't leave it here. It's the only wheelchair my mother has. No one is leaving it behind. Annie still looked worried. Really, sir? I promise. She looked at Richard, then gave a small nod. Thank you. Richard was about to help Sarah when Annie gently caught the sleeve of his shirt. Sir. Richard turned. What is it? Annie looked down at her wet shoes. I don't know how much I'll have to pay you back. Richard looked at her hands. Her fingers were red and swollen. The skin around her knuckles was cracked. One glove was torn. Then he looked at the only blanket they had brought, the blanket Annie had wrapped entirely around her mother for nearly 3 kilometers. We'll talk about that later. He held out his hand. Annie looked at it for a second. Then she took it. Annie's fingers were freezing. When she placed her hand in Richard's to pull herself up, he could barely feel her grip. Beneath the worn glove, torn open at the fingertips, strips of white bandage showed through. Richard helped her steady herself, then turned towards Sarah. His driver had already moved to the other side of the damaged wheelchair. Mrs. Carter, we're going to help you into the car. We'll take it very slowly. Sarah nodded, her lips faintly blue from the cold. My legs can't support me. That's all right. Don't try to force them. Annie immediately stepped forward. I know how to lift my mom. Richard looked at her reddened hands and shook his head. Then tell us how. Annie paused. Perhaps she was so used to doing everything herself that she had never expected a man like Richard to actually let her tell him what to do. Keep her knees together. One person supports her under the arms, and the other supports her hips. Please, don't pull on her legs. It hurts her. All right. Richard followed every instruction. He and the driver carefully lifted Sarah from the wheelchair. Annie stayed close beside them, one hand gripping her mother's elbow, as if letting go might somehow cause Sarah to fall again. The rear door of the SUV opened. Warm air immediately spilled out. The moment Sarah was settled into the seat, she began trembling even harder. Annie climbed in right after her, pulled the blanket over her legs, and adjusted the coat Richard had draped around Sarah's shoulders. Mom, how do you feel? I'm starting to warm up. Your hands? Still cold. Annie immediately took both of her mother's hands and rubbed them quickly between her own. Her hands were even colder. Richard noticed but said nothing. He took the front passenger seat, leaving the entire back row for Annie and Sarah. The driver asked, Where to, sir? St. Vincent Hospital. Annie's head snapped up. Wait, East Side is closer. Richard turned around. We're not going to the therapy center. My mom has therapy this morning. She's been out in the cold too long. A doctor needs to examine her first. But we've already missed too many sessions. Sarah gently touched her daughter's arm. Annie. She turned toward her mother. I can't feel my legs. Every trace of protest disappeared from Annie's face. She looked down at her mother's legs and pulled the blanket higher. Take us to the hospital, please. The SUV pulled away from the curb. For the entire drive, Annie barely took her eyes off Sarah. Every few seconds, she touched her mother's hands, checked the blanket, then looked down at her feet. She kept finding one thing after another to do, as though something terrible might happen if she stopped even for a minute. Richard turned halfway around in his seat. How long has your mother been using a wheelchair? A little over a year. What happened? She got sick. Sarah looked at her daughter with a tired smile. I can still answer for myself. Annie adjusted the coat around her shoulders. Then you tell him. Sarah looked at Richard. A neurological condition. The name is so long I stopped bothering to remember it. I've lost most of the strength in my legs. I can still move them a little. But standing is another matter. I need someone to support me. Is therapy helping? Yes, a lot. Annie said almost at the same time. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Annie looked at her. Well, it is. Sarah gave a soft laugh. She remembers every number. Last week, I stood for 8 seconds between the parallel bars. 8.5. C'est? For the first time since Richard had found them by the side of the road, Annie's eyes lit up. Dr. Harper says Mom is getting stronger. She can transfer from her wheelchair to a chair much better now. Some days she can even put weight on her legs if someone supports her. She looked at her mother, hope filling her voice. If we just keep going to therapy, she'll keep getting better. Richard looked out at the snow-covered streets beyond the window. Is that why you take her there every morning? Annie nodded. They give her therapy for free. What kind of program? A community program. They have a few sponsored spots. No transportation? Sarah answered. There are a few services, but they cost money, Annie said immediately. Some of them do, Sarah corrected her. And the free ones don't work with our schedule. Richard asked, what about the city bus? Annie looked at him. She was still trying to be polite, but the exhaustion was obvious now. Have you ever pushed a wheelchair through a pile of plowed snow almost 6 inches high just to get to a bus stop? Richard didn't answer. Annie immediately lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be rude. You don't need to apologize. You were telling the truth. Annie looked at him, slightly surprised. The driver spoke up. We're about 7 minutes from the hospital. Sarah shifted slightly and winced. Annie noticed immediately. Where does it hurt? My hip. From when the wheelchair tipped over? Probably. It's not too bad. If it hurts, you need to tell me. I never said it didn't matter. Annie leaned down to check the seatbelt, pulling it slightly away so it wouldn't press against Sarah's hip. Richard watched her hands move from the blanket to the seatbelt and then back to Sarah's coat. You do all of this before school? Annie looked up. Most days. And you work too? Sarah let out a quiet laugh. You should ask her how many jobs she has. Mum, Richard asked. How many? Annie shrugged. Just a few shifts. Sarah counted them for her. She works at a grocery store after school, a diner on weekends, and if someone calls needing a house cleaned, she takes that too. Richard looked at Annie. When do you sleep? When everything is done. I asked what time. Annie looked down at her hands. I don't really have a set time. Sarah looked at her daughter, and the faint smile slowly disappeared from her face. She thinks she has to handle everything herself. Annie pulled the blanket higher around her mother. If I don't do it, who will? Sarah looked at Richard. You hear that? I have to listen to that every single day. Mom, please. No. You always pretend you're fine. I am fine. Sarah pointed toward her hands. You're sitting here wearing gloves with holes in them because you gave me the good pair, and you still call that fine? Annie immediately looked down. Richard followed her gaze. Sarah was wearing a thick pair of insulated gloves. Annie's gloves were so old that several of her fingertips were completely exposed. Her skin was red from the cold, and small cuts around her fingers were wrapped in makeshift bandages. Sarah's voice softened. The blanket too. Mum, she gives me everything that keeps her warm. If Annie's love and sacrifice for her mother touched your heart, please like this video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. And subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happens next. Annie pressed her lips together. Because you can't move enough to keep yourself warm. And you can? I'm the one pushing the wheelchair. I get warm. You're not pushing it now. Annie turned toward the window. Richard said nothing. He understood that if he pitied her now, Annie would only try harder to prove that she didn't need anyone's help. So he changed the subject. What do you two usually eat after therapy? Annie turned back. What? Breakfast. Sarah smiled. Finally, someone asks the right question. Annie almost laughed. We eat whatever we bring with us. What did you bring today? Peanut butter sandwiches. Richard looked toward the driver. Does the hospital cafeteria still serve breakfast? Yes, sir. Annie immediately shook her head. We don't need... Annie. Sarah cut her off. What, Mom? I want eggs. Annie looked at her. And bacon. You complain every time I make bacon. I complain about the bacon you make. I never said I don't like bacon. The driver raised a fist to his mouth to hide a laugh. Richard laughed too. Annie looked at her mother and finally smiled. Just a little. Then the hospital came into view. Her smile vanished instantly. Annie stared at the emergency entrance, the ambulances, and the glowing red sign above the doors. Her hands slowed on the blanket. How much is this going to cost? Richard turned around. We'll deal with it. No. Annie looked at him. I need to know before Mom goes inside. Your mother needs a doctor. I know. Then what are you worried about? Annie was quiet for a moment before asking in a very small voice. What happens after today? Richard looked at her. What do you mean? When something happens, people always say to go to the hospital first and worry about the money later. She clasped her freezing fingers together. Then everyone goes home, but the bill still comes. Richard didn't answer immediately. Annie wasn't accusing him of anything. She was simply afraid. At 18 years old, she had already become far too accustomed to asking herself what every act of help might eventually cost her. The SUV stopped beneath the covered emergency entrance. Richard opened his door. Then when the bill comes, I'll still be here. Annie watched him step out into the cold. She didn't believe him yet. But this time, when Richard came around to help Sarah, Annie didn't tell him to step away. The emergency department doors opened before Richard reached them. A nurse came forward with a hospital wheelchair, but Annie stopped beside Sarah and shook her head. Her legs are weak. Please don't ask her to stand. We won't, the nurse said. We'll transfer her. Annie stayed close while two staff members moved Sarah from the SUV into the hospital chair. She watched their hands, corrected the position of her mother's right foot, then tucked Richard's coat and the gray blanket around her again. Her right leg gets stiff if it turns inward, Annie said. The nurse nodded. Thank you. Keep telling us what she needs. That simple answer eased something in Annie's face. Richard followed them through the sliding doors. His driver, Michael, came in behind him. Mr. Bennett, Michael said quietly. Your office has called 3 times. Richard took his phone from his pocket, looked at the screen, then switched it off. They know where I am. They know you canceled. They don't know why. They don't need to. At the registration desk, Annie gave Sarah's name, date of birth, address, and insurance information from memory. She answered quickly, until the woman behind the counter asked for a copay. Annie stopped. How much? We won't know the full amount until... How much today? Sarah touched her daughter's wrist. Annie, I just need to know. Richard stepped beside her. Put any amount not covered by insurance on my account. Annie turned sharply. No. The registration clerk looked between them. Richard kept his voice low. Your mother needs to be seen. She can be seen. I'll make payments. You're already making payments on everything else. That doesn't mean you get to pay this. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. Can the two of you argue after somebody gets feeling back into my feet? Annie immediately turned toward her. Are they still numb? A little. That ended the discussion for the moment. A nurse took Sarah through the treatment doors. Annie tried to follow, but another nurse gently caught her attention. Before you go, I need to look at your hands. My hands are fine. The nurse looked at the torn glove. Take it off. I'm here for my mother. And you were outside too. Annie glanced toward the doors Sarah had disappeared through. Richard said, I'll stay where she can see me. Annie gave him a guarded look. She doesn't know you. No, but she knows you're 10 feet away getting your hands checked. That seemed reasonable enough to Annie, though she still looked unhappy about it. She removed the gloves. The nurse's expression changed when she saw the cracked skin, swollen knuckles, and pale patches along 2 fingers. How long have your hands looked like this? Annie shrugged. They get bad in winter. Do they always get this cold? I work with them all day. That wasn't my question. Annie glanced away. Sometimes. The nurse guided her toward a chair. Richard stayed near Sarah's treatment area, far enough to give the family privacy but close enough that Annie could see him. A few minutes later, a physician came over. Are you family? Richard shook his head. No. I found them outside after the wheelchair broke. The doctor looked toward Annie. She got her mother here? I drove them. I mean before that. Richard understood. She was pushing the wheelchair to physical therapy. The doctor looked through the glass toward Sarah. In this weather? Apparently she does it most mornings. The doctor's eyebrows tightened, but he said nothing more before entering Sarah's treatment space. Michael approached Richard. Sir, I've arranged pickup for the damaged wheelchair. They can bring it to a repair shop. Richard looked at him. Don't repair it yet. Michael paused. Have someone qualified inspect it first. If it's worth repairing, fine. If not, replace it. Understood. And no one contacts the media. Michael gave him a puzzled look. I wasn't planning to. Good. Make sure the office understands the same thing. Michael nodded and walked away to make the call. Annie had heard enough. Why would the media know? Richard turned. Her hands were now wrapped in clean gauze across several fingers. They won't. You said that like it was possible. It's possible when people around me think everything I do needs a press release. Annie's expression hardened. Richard noticed immediately. No. No what? No cameras. No photographs. No company story. Nobody uses your mother's name. You expect me to believe that? I expect you to decide for yourself. Annie studied him for several seconds. Who are you? Richard Bennett. The name registered slowly. Annie looked at Michael, then at the black SUV visible through the entrance windows. Bennett Logistics? Yes. And those buildings downtown? Some of them. Sarah's voice came from behind the curtain. Annie? Annie went to her at once. I'm right here. Richard remained outside until Sarah called. Mr. Bennett, you can come in too. Apparently my daughter has decided you're suspicious. Annie looked at her mother. I didn't say suspicious. You have that face. I have one face. Sarah almost smiled. The doctor entered and checked the monitor before speaking. Mrs. Carter, your temperature is coming back up. I don't see signs of serious cold injury, but I want to keep you here a little longer. I'm also concerned about some swelling in your right leg and the amount of muscle weakness you're describing. Sarah nodded. The weakness isn't new. I understand. Who manages your rehabilitation? Dr. Emily Harper at Eastside Community Rehabilitation. The physician typed the name into the chart. Good. I'd like to speak with her. Your therapy schedule matters, but so does making sure you're medically ready for it each day. Annie leaned forward. Is she getting worse? Not from what I can tell right now. But consistency, nutrition, medication, proper equipment, transportation, those things all affect recovery. Physical therapy doesn't happen only in the therapy room. Annie looked down at her bandaged hands. Sarah noticed. That includes you, she said. I know. No, you don't. Mama, you think if I miss one appointment, everything falls apart. Dr. Harper said consistency matters. She didn't say freeze yourself getting me there. Richard listened without interrupting. Annie's jaw tightened. What was I supposed to do? Sarah's voice softened. Ask for help. From who? That question came out faster than Annie intended. Nobody answered immediately. Annie looked from her mother to Richard and then away. That's what I thought. Richard understood then that this wasn't pride for the sake of pride. Annie had built her life around the expectation that every problem eventually returned to her hands. He pulled a chair closer but did not sit until Sarah nodded. Annie, I'm going to say something, and you're probably not going to like it. That's becoming a pattern today. You don't owe me anything because I stopped the car. She looked at him. And if I help with the hospital bill, you still won't owe me. That's easy for you to say. Why? Because you can afford to forget the amount. Richard accepted that. You're right. The answer surprised her. He continued, but money isn't always a debt between people. It is when you don't have any. Sarah watched the exchange closely. Richard rested his hands on his knees. There was someone in my life I kept telling myself I would make time for later. I thought paying for things counted as being there. I learned too late that those aren't the same thing. Annie did not ask for details. Richard did not offer them. He only said, some debts aren't paid back, they're paid forward. Before Annie could respond, a nurse entered with 2 cups of coffee and a tray. Mrs. Carter requested eggs and bacon. Annie looked at her mother. Sarah lifted both hands slightly. I almost froze this morning. I'm eating bacon. The tension in Annie's face finally loosened. Richard smiled. Sarah pointed toward him. You too. You look like a man who forgot breakfast. I had coffee. That's not breakfast. It is in my line of work. Then your line of work is wrong. Annie laughed before she could stop herself. It lasted only a second, but Richard heard it, and as Sarah began eating, Annie kept one bandaged hand on the edge of her mother's blanket, as if she still needed proof that it was there. Richard watched her, then reached for his phone and turned it on. 31 missed messages appeared. He ignored every one of them and called his assistant. When you get this, he said, clear my morning and find me the best wheelchair mobility specialist in Cleveland. Annie looked up. Richard met her eyes. The broken chair gets replaced properly. I didn't agree to that. I know, Mr. Bennett. Then argue with me after your mother finishes her bacon. Sarah raised her fork. For once, Annie, listen to the billionaire. Annie shook her head, but a reluctant smile returned. For the first time that morning, the next mile no longer depended entirely on her hands. By late morning, color had returned to Sarah's face, but Annie still checked the blanket every few minutes as though the cold might somehow find its way through the hospital walls. A nurse came in carrying discharge papers and stopped when she saw Annie reading the same page twice. "Your mother's doing well enough to go home," she said. "But the doctor wants her to follow up with Dr. Harper and keep the leg warm today." "No long trip outside." Annie nodded. "We'll take a cab." Richard, standing near the window with his phone in one hand, turned around. "No." Annie looked at him. "No? You're not putting your mother into a regular cab when she can't safely transfer without assistance. We've done it before. That doesn't make it a good idea. We don't have many good ideas to choose from." Sarah lowered the paperwork into her lap. "That one sounded better in your head, honey." Annie gave her mother a look. Richard slipped his phone into his pocket. "Michael is bringing the SUV around. We'll take you home." Annie started to object, but Sarah spoke first. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Bennett." "Mama." "What?" "My feet finally feel like feet again. I'm not arguing with heated seats." Richard smiled. "Richard is fine." Sarah shook her head. "I was raised to call a man I met this morning Mr. Bennett until at least lunchtime. That seems fair." Annie reached for the discharge papers. "We still have the wheelchair problem. I haven't forgotten. You said you were finding somebody." "I found somebody." That answer came too quickly for Annie's comfort. Richard checked the time. "A mobility specialist is meeting us at your apartment at 1. "At our apartment?" "He needs to measure your mother properly before recommending a chair." Annie's eyebrows drew together. "How did you arrange that already?" "I made a call." "One call?" Richard nodded. Annie looked down at her bandaged hands. For him, one call could move equipment, appointments, people, and schedules. For her, one phone call usually meant 20 minutes on hold, another number to try, or a price she could not pay. Richard noticed her expression. "What?" "Nothing. That didn't look like nothing." Annie folded the papers carefully. "It's just strange." "What is?" "You say you need something, and somebody does it." Richard did not have an answer that would make the difference between their lives smaller, so he did not pretend there was one. "Yes," he said, "most of the time." Annie appreciated the honesty more than she expected. Sarah reached for her daughter's wrist. "Help me with my coat." Richard's coat was still around Sarah's shoulders. Annie touched the heavy fabric and looked toward him. "You need this back." "Not until we're in the car. You've been walking around without it all morning." "I survived." Annie glanced at her own thin coat. Richard followed her eyes. "So did you," he said. "That doesn't mean either of us should make a habit of it." An orderly arrived with a hospital wheelchair. Annie guided Sarah's right foot onto the support and checked its position. Richard stepped aside and let her direct the transfer. This time Annie did not insist on doing all the lifting herself. Outside, Michael had pulled the SUV beneath the covered entrance. "Morning, Mrs. Carter," he said as he opened the rear door. Sarah smiled. "It's nearly noon. Then I'm behind schedule. That makes 2 of us." Michael helped secure Sarah comfortably while Annie climbed in beside her. Richard took the front seat again. As they pulled away, Annie checked the time on her phone and made a face. Sarah saw it. "What? I'm supposed to be at school." "You're not going. I have history last period. You have bandages on both hands." "I can still listen." "You were outside in record cold this morning." "I'm aware." Richard glanced back. "You're planning to go to school after this?" Annie looked at him as if there were no alternative. "I have work tonight too." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. "Here we go." Richard asked, "What time?" "4. "At the grocery store?" Annie nodded. "And after that?" "Home." Sarah opened one eye. "Tell him tomorrow." Annie sighed. "Dinner." 6 in the morning. Richard turned more fully in his seat. "You work at a diner too?" "Weekends." "And you clean houses?" "When somebody needs help." "While finishing school." "It sounds worse when you list it." "It sounds exactly the same." Annie looked toward the window. Sarah spoke gently. "She won't miss a shift unless somebody sends her home. Because shifts pay bills." "I know what shifts do." "Then you know." Richard listened to the exchange and understood that money was not simply money in Annie's mind. It was heat, food, medicine. Rent due on a date that did not care whether Sarah had been sick. What happens if you miss tonight? He asked. My check is smaller. How much smaller? Annie turned toward him. Why? Because your hands need rest. My hands aren't paying attention to what they need. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. Sarah gave Richard a tired smile. You're learning. When they reached the Carter apartment building, Michael parked near the entrance. Annie stepped out first and looked toward the front steps. Richard followed her gaze. There was no ramp at the main entrance. He frowned. How does your mother get inside? Annie pointed toward the side of the building. Service entrance. There's a loading ramp. They went around back. The ramp was narrow, patched in several places, and half covered in packed snow. Richard stopped at the bottom. This is what you use every day? It works. That wasn't what I asked. Annie took position behind the hospital wheelchair. It's what we have. Richard reached for one handle. I'll help. I can push her. I know. Annie looked at his hand, then at the slope ahead. For once, she moved slightly to one side. Fine, but keep the chair straight. The ramp pulls left. Richard nodded. Together they pushed Sarah upward. Halfway up, Richard felt the chair drift toward the edge. Annie corrected it immediately. Left wheel. Watch it. I've got it. No, you don't. Push from the center. He adjusted. The chair moved more easily. At the top, Richard looked down the ramp, and then at Annie. Nearly 2 miles every morning. A damaged chair. A service entrance. Snow. Work. School. Therapy. None of those things alone explained her exhaustion. Together, they did. Inside the apartment, Sarah pointed toward the kitchen. Coffee? Annie looked at her. You just got out of the hospital. That is exactly why I need coffee. Richard almost declined, then caught himself. I'd like one. Annie removed her thin coat and hung it beside the door. Underneath, she wore a faded grocery store sweatshirt. Sarah noticed Richard looking at it. She goes in at 4. Annie opened a cabinet. Mama. Richard looked at the clock, then at Annie's bandaged hands. Then, at the old utility notice held to the refrigerator. He did not offer money. Not yet. Instead he asked, where do you keep the coffee? Annie pointed to the second shelf. Richard rolled up his sleeves. I can make coffee. Sarah raised an eyebrow. A billionaire who knows how to work a coffee maker? Richard reached for the pot. Let's not spread that around. For the first time since they entered the apartment, Annie laughed without immediately stopping herself. Then someone knocked at the door. Richard checked the time. 1 o'clock. Annie looked toward him. That's the wheelchair specialist? Yes. She looked at Sarah, then at the door. Her expression changed again. Caught somewhere between gratitude and caution. Richard did not move to open it. He waited. This was their home. After a moment, Annie crossed the room herself and reached for the handle. Annie opened the door to a woman carrying a black equipment case and a folding measuring frame. Annie Carter? Yes. I'm Lauren Mitchell, mobility specialist. Mr. Bennett asked me to take a look at your mother's chair. Annie stepped aside. It's not here. I know. The repair company sent me photos. Richard came from the kitchen with 2 mugs of coffee. They already got it? Lauren nodded. About 20 minutes ago. I spoke with the technician on the way over. Sarah looked concerned. Can they fix it? Lauren set her case beside the table. They can fix almost anything. The better question is whether they should. Annie closed the door. What does that mean? Lauren sat beside Sarah and pulled up several photographs on her tablet. One showed the broken rear wheel. Another showed rust around part of the frame. The axle failed, but that isn't the only problem. The frame has stress near this joint. The seat width isn't right for your mother. And these foot supports are sitting too low. Annie leaned over the screen. We bought it used. Lauren nodded without judgment. That explains some of it. It worked. It moved, Lauren said. That's not always the same as working properly. Annie's face tightened. Lauren noticed and softened her voice. You kept it going longer than most people could. I'm not criticizing you. Sarah pointed toward her daughter. Good luck convincing her of that. Mama, I've known you longer than anybody here. Lauren smiled and opened her case. Mrs. Carter, may I ask you some questions? Sarah is fine. Sarah, do you have pain while sitting? Lower back sometimes. Right hip too. How long can you stay in the chair before you need to change position? Sarah thought about it. An hour before I start complaining. Annie corrected her. 30 minutes. Sarah looked at her. Nobody asked my supervisor. You complain after 30. I complain because it gives me something to do. Lauren laughed. 30 minutes is useful information. She began taking measurements. Hip width, lower leg length, back height. Annie watched every step. What are you measuring that for? Seat depth. And that? Footrest position. Why does the back have to be measured? So the support lands where it should. Richard handed Sarah a cup of coffee, then gave the other to Annie. This one has sugar. Annie accepted it carefully with her bandaged hands. How did you know? Your mother told me. You two have known each other for 30 minutes and she's already telling you my business. Sarah took a sip. He makes better coffee than you. Richard looked pleased. Finally, recognition. Don't get comfortable, Annie said. Lauren finished measuring and sat back. I'd recommend a new chair rather than repairing the old one. Annie's brief smile disappeared. How much? Lauren glanced toward Richard. Annie caught it immediately. Don't look at him. I asked you. Lauren gave her the approximate range. Annie lowered the coffee. No, Sarah sighed. Annie, we can repair the old one. Lauren shook her head. I wouldn't recommend putting Sarah back into it for daily use. But it can be repaired? Technically, yes. Then repair it, Richard said. Or we replace it. Annie turned toward him. You've already paid for the hospital. I haven't received a bill yet. You said you would. I will. And now a wheelchair? Yes. You don't even know us. Richard set his mug down. I know enough to know your mother needs a safe chair. That doesn't make it your responsibility. No. The simple answer made Annie pause. Richard continued. I'm not doing it because somebody assigned me responsibility. I'm doing it because I can. Annie looked at Lauren. Can we get an estimate for repairing the old one anyway? Of course. Thank you. Richard did not argue. Lauren began showing Sarah several chair options on the tablet. Sarah listened closely, asking about cushioning and support. Annie stood behind her, drinking coffee and checking the clock twice in less than a minute. Richard noticed. You're thinking about work. My shift starts at 4. Sarah turned. Call them. And say what? That you spent the morning outside with your mother and then at the emergency department. I already missed school. So? So I'm not missing work too. Richard checked the bandages on her hands. How are you stocking shelves like that? I'm on register tonight. You can barely bend 2 fingers. I have 8 others. Sarah closed her eyes. This is my life. Annie grabbed her grocery store sweatshirt from the back of a chair. Richard said, at least call your manager. And lose 4 hours? You were treated for cold exposure. They were worried about my fingers. They didn't admit me. Annie. She stopped. Something in Richard's voice had changed. Not command. Concern. He nodded toward the kitchen table. Sit for 1 minute. I'm going to be late. Then I'll drive you. That made her laugh once. You're going to drop me off at the grocery store? Apparently. In that? She pointed through the window toward the black SUV. Richard looked outside. It has wheels. Sarah smiled into her coffee. Annie shook her head. You don't have somewhere to be? Yes. Then go. Richard studied her. I canceled my morning. It's afternoon. I noticed. Don't you run a company? People keep telling me that. Then shouldn't you be there? Richard leaned against the counter. If the place collapses because I miss half a day, I've hired very badly. Sarah laughed. Annie tried not to. Lauren looked up from her tablet. I'm staying out of this. Annie finally sat, but only on the edge of the chair. Richard pointed toward her hands. Call your manager. She hesitated, then took out her phone. Her manager answered after 3 rings. Hi, Mr. Collins, it's Annie. She listened. No, sir, my mother's okay. We had an issue this morning. Another pause. I can still come in. Richard watched her expression change. You sure? She listened again. Okay, thank you. When the call ended, Sarah asked, well? He said Kim can cover me. And? He told me to stay home. Sarah looked toward Richard. I've been trying to accomplish that for an hour. Richard smiled. Apparently Mr. Collins has authority. Annie put her phone down. It means my check is short. Sarah's smile faded. Richard saw the worry return immediately. Annie was already calculating what 4 lost hours would remove from the week. He wanted to tell her the amount meant nothing. He knew better now. Instead he asked, what bill comes next? Annie looked at him sharply. No, I'm asking, and I'm not answering. Sarah glanced toward the refrigerator. Annie followed her eyes. The heating notice was still under the Ohio magnet. Richard saw it too, but said nothing. Lauren broke the tension by turning her tablet towards Sarah. I think I found the right chair. Sarah examined the screen. Annie came closer despite herself. Lauren explained the supports, cushion, wheel position, and brakes. Sarah asked practical questions. Annie asked twice as many. When Lauren finished, Annie touched the edge of the tablet. Would she be able to push it herself sometimes? If therapy improves her upper body strength, yes. Annie looked at her mother. Sarah looked back. Neither said anything for a moment. Then Sarah smiled. That sounds nice. Annie's expression softened. Richard saw it. Not gratitude toward him. Not relief about money. Hope that one day Sarah might move across a room without Annie behind her. Richard pointed toward the screen. Order it. Annie immediately turned. Mr. Bennett. Sarah raised one hand. Annie. What? Not today. Annie stared at her mother. Sarah reached for her bandaged hand. For one afternoon, let somebody else carry something. Annie looked down at their joined hands. This time she did not say no. Lauren left a little after 2 with Sarah's measurements, insurance information, and Richard's promise that the new wheelchair should be ordered without delay. Annie stood near the window until Lauren's car disappeared down the street, then turned toward Richard. How long does something like that take? A chair fitted specifically for your mother? Lauren said several days if she can get the model locally. And until then? Richard had already asked the same question. A temporary chair is coming this afternoon. Annie folded her arms. You already arranged that too? Yes. She looked at Sarah. Does everybody know what's happening except me? Sarah raised her coffee. I'm enjoying it. Mama, for once, I'm not the one making decisions. It's relaxing. Annie wanted to argue, but her phone vibrated on the kitchen table. She glanced at the screen and immediately picked it up. East Side. She answered. Hello? Yes, this is Annie. Her expression changed as she listened. No, she's home now. The hospital released her. Sarah motioned for the phone, but Annie held up one finger. Yes, Dr. Harper, she's doing better. A pause. No, the chair can't be repaired today. Richard saw Annie turn toward the window. Tomorrow? She listened again. I understand. When the call ended, Sarah asked, What did Emily say? She wants you back tomorrow if you feel well enough. That's good. Annie nodded, but her eyes remained on the floor. Richard recognized the look now. She was calculating another problem. How are you getting there? I'll figure it out. With what chair? The temporary one. I meant transportation. Annie reached for the empty coffee cups. Same way. Sarah's expression tightened. Absolutely not. Mama, the weather is supposed to improve. You are not pushing me nearly 2 miles tomorrow. I've done it before. And today the wheel broke in the middle of the road. The new chair won't. Sarah looked toward Richard as if asking him to explain something she had already explained too many times. Richard did not step in immediately. He asked Annie, If you could choose any reasonable way to get your mother to therapy tomorrow, what would you choose? She rinsed a cup beneath the faucet. Something wheelchair accessible. A van? Yes. With a ramp? Yes. Reliable pickup? Annie shut off the water and turned around. What are you doing? Finding out what you need. I know what you're doing. Then answer the question. She dried her hands carefully because of the gauze around her fingers. A van would work. Richard took out his phone. No. He paused. Annie pointed at him. Don't make another call. Why? Because every time you touch that phone, something expensive shows up at our door. Sarah covered a smile with her cup. Richard slipped the phone back into his pocket. All right. No call yet. Thank you. How are you planning to get your mother there? I told you. I'll push her. With injured hands. They'll heal. In the cold. I own a coat. Richard glanced at the thin coat hanging beside the door. Annie followed his eyes. Don't. I didn't say anything. You were thinking loudly. Sarah laughed. Richard sat at the kitchen table. Come sit down. I'm fine standing. I know. Sit anyway. Annie hesitated, then took the chair across from him. Richard leaned forward. I'm not trying to run your life. You're doing a pretty good impression. That's fair. She did not expect him to concede so easily. He continued. But your mother needs therapy. You need school. You also need your hands to heal. Pushing a wheelchair across Cleveland before sunrise solves one problem by creating three more. What do you want me to do? Let me arrange transportation. For how long? Until you have another solution. That could be weeks. Yes. Do you know what those vans cost? Yes. Then you know I can't pay for that. I didn't ask you to. Annie pushed her chair back slightly. There it is again. What? You paying? Sarah spoke from across the room. Annie, there are worse habits a man could have. This isn't funny. I know. Sarah set down the cup. But you're acting like accepting a ride is the same as handing somebody your life. You don't know what he expects. Richard answered before Sarah could. Nothing. Annie turned toward him. You say that now. I'll say it tomorrow too. And next week? Yes. She studied him. You don't know anything about me. I know you work at a grocery store, wash dishes on weekends, take cleaning jobs when you can get them, go to school, manage your mother's appointments, and push her almost 2 miles to therapy. That's not knowing me. No. But it's enough to know you're not looking for an easy way out. Annie's eyes dropped to her hands. Richard softened his voice. Accepting transportation doesn't erase what you've done. That's not what I'm worried about. Then what are you worried about? She took longer to answer. Owing somebody who can afford to ask for anything. Richard understood the sentence immediately. Money had always given him choices. Annie had learned that money could also give other people leverage. He sat straighter. Then let's make this simple. No publicity. No photographs. No favors. No obligation to me or my company. Your mother gets to therapy safely. That's all. Annie looked at Sarah. Sarah said, I would like that. You would like anything with a heater? Correct. A reluctant smile touched Annie's face and disappeared. She looked back at Richard. 1 week. What? You can arrange the van for 1 week. After that, I figure something out. Richard knew better than to push. 1 week. Annie held out her bandaged hand. Richard looked at it. What's this? A deal. He shook it gently. A deal. Only then did he take out his phone. Michael answered on the first ring. I need a wheelchair, accessible van tomorrow morning, Richard said. Pick up at 5:30. Eastside Community Rehabilitation Center. Annie interrupted. 5:20. Richard covered the phone. Why? Traffic gets worse after 6. He uncovered it. 5:20. Michael confirmed the details. Richard ended the call. Sarah leaned toward Annie. You just negotiated with a billionaire? I negotiated 10 minutes. Richard stood and reached for his jacket. She's good. At the door, Annie stopped him. Mr. Bennett. He turned. Thank you. The words seemed difficult for her, so he did not make them heavier. You're welcome. Then Annie added, I'm still paying you back somehow. Richard gave her a small nod. We'll argue about that another day. After he left, Annie walked to the window and watched the black SUV pull away. Sarah came beside her in the temporary hospital chair. You trust him? Annie shook her head. Not yet. But you took the ride. That's different. How? Annie looked at her bandaged hands. Because tomorrow morning, you get to therapy. Sarah rested a hand against her daughter's arm. For Annie, that was enough reason to try trusting someone for 1 week. At 5:18 the next morning, Annie heard a vehicle stop outside. She was already standing by the window with one hand on the curtain. You've checked 3 times, Sarah said from behind her. Four. That doesn't make it better. It means I'm thorough. Sarah sat in the temporary wheelchair wearing a navy sweater, thick socks, and the gray blanket folded across her legs. Annie had dressed more carefully too. Her bandaged fingers made buttons difficult, but she had managed without asking for help. Outside, a white wheelchair-accessible van waited beneath the streetlight. No company logo, no luxury markings, just a clean van with a side ramp. Annie checked the clock. 2 minutes early. Sarah smiled. You sound disappointed. I was prepared to complain. There's always tomorrow. A knock came at the door. Annie opened it to a man in his late 50s wearing a dark winter jacket and work boots. Morning. Miss Carter? Sarah lifted a hand. That's me. The man nodded. I'm Frank. Mr. Bennett arranged your transportation to Eastside. Annie stepped into the hallway. You know how to secure her chair? Yes, ma'am. She can't stand for a transfer. Understood. Her right leg needs support. Frank waited until Annie finished. Anything else? Annie hesitated. No. Then you tell me if I miss something. That answer satisfied her enough to let him inside. The service ramp at the back of the building was still covered with patches of packed snow. Frank inspected it before moving Sarah. "I'll take the front," he said. "I can push." "I know you can. Your hands say maybe you shouldn't today." Annie glanced at the gauze around her fingers. Sarah said, "I like him already." "Mama." Frank smiled but did not take the wheelchair until Annie moved aside voluntarily. Together they guided Sarah down the ramp. Annie walked close enough to correct anything she didn't like, but Frank handled the chair without rushing. At the van, he lowered the hydraulic ramp. Sarah looked at Annie. "This feels strange. Good strange or bad strange? Ask me when I'm warm." Annie walked up beside the chair as Frank secured it to the floor anchors. She checked every strap. Frank let air. "You do this every morning?" Annie asked. "Most mornings. Medical appointments, rehab, dialysis, whatever people need. And Mr. Bennett just called you?" "He called the company. Dispatch called me." Annie looked around the van. "How much does a ride like this cost?" Frank shut the side door. "That's between Mr. Bennett and dispatch. That means expensive. That means I drive." Sarah laughed. "You two are going to get along fine." The heater ran before they left the curb. Annie sat beside her mother and watched familiar streets pass through the window. The difference unsettled her. The laundromat appeared in less than 5 minutes. The hill that usually made her shoulders burn was gone behind them before Sarah finished adjusting her blanket. They passed the corner where Annie normally stopped to flex her fingers. Then the convenience store. Mr. Alvarez was outside carrying a crate of bottled water. He recognized Sarah through the glass and lifted his hand. Sarah waved back. Annie turned to look behind them. "What?" Sarah asked. "Nothing. You keep saying that. We're already past the store." Sarah glanced through the rear window. "That is generally what vehicles do." "I know." Annie rested her bandaged hands on her knees. "It just feels wrong." Sarah studied her daughter. "What feels wrong?" "Getting there this fast. That is the purpose." "I know what the purpose is." "Then why are you upset?" Annie searched for an answer that made sense. "I'm not upset." Sarah waited. Annie sighed. "It took us almost an hour yesterday. And today it won't." "Exactly." Sarah's expression softened. "Honey, hard doesn't mean right." Annie looked at her. Sarah continued. "You've been doing something the difficult way because it was the only way we had. That doesn't mean you have to miss the difficulty when it's gone." Annie looked back through the window. "I'm not missing it." "Good. I just don't trust easy." Sarah nodded. "That I believe." They reached Eastside Community Rehabilitation Center at 5:39. Annie checked her phone twice. Frank opened the door and lowered the ramp. "We're early," she said. "Is that a problem?" "No." Frank smiled. "You really were ready to complain." Dr. Emily Harper was already inside when they entered. She came down the hall wearing navy scrubs and stopped when she saw Sarah. "There you are." Sarah lifted both arms, delivered intact. Emily looked at Annie's hands. "You, however, look like somebody lost a fight with January." "I'm fine." "Of course you are." Emily crouched beside Sarah and checked her right foot. "How are you feeling?" "Warm." "Any pain?" "Hips better. Leg feels about the same." Emily looked at Annie. "Hospital cleared her?" Annie handed over the discharge papers. Emily read them carefully. "Good. We keep today light." Sarah frowned. "I didn't come here to be treated like glass. And I didn't go through 8 years of school to take orders from you. That seems inefficient." Emily smiled. "You're feeling better." Annie stood beside the therapy mat while Emily helped Sarah through gentle stretches. The movements were slower than usual. No standing practice yet. Annie checked the clock. Emily noticed. "You have school." "I know. When do you need to leave?" 7:15. "You'll make it." Annie looked toward the window. "Frank said he can take us back." "He can. I'm not used to planning around somebody else." Emily sat on the edge of the mat. "That isn't what this is about." "What?" "You're not planning around him. Transportation is planning around you for once." Annie said nothing. Emily nodded toward Sarah. "Your mother's job is therapy." Then toward Annie. "Your job is not to destroy yourself getting her here." Sarah pointed at Emily. "I've been saying that." "You say many things. Most of them correct." A knock sounded at the open therapy room door. Frank stood there holding Annie's backpack. "You left this in the van." Annie took it. "Thank you." Her phone vibrated inside. A message from an unknown number appeared. "Good morning. I was told the van arrived on time. Please tell your mother I hope therapy goes well. Richard Bennett." Annie read it twice. Sarah noticed. Him? Yes. What did he say? Annie handed her the phone. Sarah read the message and gave it back. No speech, no questions. I like that. Annie typed a reply, deleted it, then tried again. She finally sent 4 words. She made it safely. Thanks. Less than a minute later, the phone vibrated again. Good. That's all I needed to know. Annie stared at the message. Emily called from across the room. Annie, come here. Sarah was positioned between the parallel bars. What are you doing? Annie asked. Nothing dramatic, Emily said. We're checking how she feels with some weight through her legs. Annie moved closer. Sarah gripped the bars. Emily supported her at the waist. Ready? Sarah nodded. Slowly, she pushed upward. Her arms shook first. Then her legs took part of the weight. Annie stopped moving. 1, Emily counted. Sarah held. 2. Her right knee trembled. 3. She lowered herself back into the chair. Annie let out the breath she had been holding. Sarah looked up at her. That wasn't 8. No. Don't make that face. What face? The one where 3 seconds becomes bad news. Annie crouched beside her. You were in the hospital yesterday. Exactly. Emily nodded. 3 seconds today is useful. We build from what her body gives us. Annie looked at Sarah's legs, then at her own wrapped hands. For months she had measured progress by how far she could push, how much she could work, how little help she could need. That morning, her mother had traveled nearly 2 miles without Annie pushing once. And somehow, they had still arrived. Annie was beginning to understand that not every burden disappeared when another person helped carry it. Sometimes it simply stopped crushing the person who had been holding it alone. By the 4th morning, Annie no longer stood at the window waiting for the van. She still checked the clock. She still watched Frank secure Sarah's chair. She still tested one of the floor straps herself before sitting down. But she stopped asking what each trip cost. Sarah noticed. You're improving. At what? Not interrogating everybody who helps us. I asked Frank 3 questions. Yesterday you asked 7. They were important. Frank closed the van door. For the record, I'm enjoying the decline. Annie pointed at him. Drive. Yes, ma'am. Sarah laughed as the van pulled away. The arrangement was supposed to last 1 week. Annie had kept count. 4 mornings down, 3 left. She had already begun planning what happened afterward. Her hands were healing. The cracked skin no longer bled when she bent her fingers, and she had returned to the grocery store the previous evening. If the weather stayed clear, she believed she could push Sarah again once the new wheelchair arrived. She had not mentioned that plan to Richard. She had a feeling he would have opinions. At Eastside, Emily worked Sarah harder than she had the day before. They practiced transferring from the wheelchair to a padded bench, then standing between the parallel bars. Don't pull with your arms first, Emily said. Let your legs do something. Sarah frowned. They've been avoiding responsibility for a year. Then today is a performance review. Annie smiled from a chair near the wall. Sarah planted both feet. Emily supported her hips. Forward. Sarah pushed. Her arms tightened around the bars. But this time her knees held. 1, Emily counted. Sarah remained upright. 2, 3, 4. Her right leg began shaking. 5. Sarah lowered herself onto the bench. Annie was already moving toward her. I'm fine, Sarah said. I didn't say anything. You moved. I'm allowed to move. Emily checked Sarah's pulse. Both of you saved the argument. 5 seconds is good. Sarah looked at Annie. Hear that? I heard. You're making the disappointed face. I'm not disappointed. Then fix your eyebrows. Annie laughed and sat back down. Her phone vibrated. Richard. She hesitated before answering. Hello? Good morning. You know most people text. I'm old-fashioned. You're 50. Exactly. Ancient. She heard papers moving on his end. How is your mother? 5 seconds today. That sounds better than yesterday. It is. Then why do you sound worried? Annie looked toward Sarah, who was talking with Emily. I don't. You're a poor liar. Everybody keeps saying that. Richard paused. Lauren called me. Annie sat straighter. About the chair? It came in early. When? This morning. Annie glanced toward Sarah. She can get it today? If Lauren approves the final fit. A smile came before Annie could stop it. Really? Really? Then she remembered herself. How much was it? Richard sighed. You made it 4 days. What does that mean? 4 days without asking me what something cost. I asked Frank. That doesn't count. It absolutely counts. Annie. Richard. It was the first time she had called him that. Both of them noticed. Annie cleared her throat. When is Lauren coming? 3 this afternoon. I'm at school until 2:30. I know. How do you know my schedule? Your mother told me. Annie looked across the room. Sarah was smiling at her. Traitor, Annie mouthed. Sarah shrugged. Richard continued. Lauren can meet you at home. Okay. And before you ask, no, you don't need to miss work tonight. I wasn't going to. You were thinking about it. You're getting annoying. I've been told. Annie lowered her voice. Thank you. You're welcome. She ended the call and returned to Sarah. New chairs here. Sarah's face brightened. Today? 3 o'clock. Emily heard them. Good. Bring it tomorrow. I want to check Sarah's posture in it before we start standing work. Sarah groaned. Everybody wants to inspect me. That's because you complain professionally, Annie said. Sarah pointed at her. I remember who started that joke. After therapy, Frank dropped Annie at school before taking Sarah home. Annie almost asked to go with her mother instead. But Sarah refused. You have a chemistry test. It's 20 questions. Then you have 20 reasons to get out of this van. Frank opened the door. Annie remained seated. Sarah looked at her. Go. What if Lauren comes early? I know how to answer a door. What if your leg starts hurting? I know how to use a telephone. What if... Annie. She stopped. Sarah reached for her hand. I'm going home in a heated van. I have food in the refrigerator. My medicine is on the counter. Lauren is coming later. You don't have to manage every minute. Annie looked down at their hands. I know. No. You're learning. Annie stepped out. Frank closed the door, and Sarah waved through the glass as the van pulled away. Annie stood on the sidewalk with her backpack over one shoulder and watched until the vehicle turned the corner. For once, she entered school without checking whether her mother had made it home by foot. At 3 to 10 that afternoon, Lauren rolled the new wheelchair into the Carter apartment. Annie arrived 6 minutes later. She stopped just inside the doorway. The chair looked nothing like the old one. The frame was lighter. The seat supported Sarah's hips properly. The footrests were adjusted to keep her legs level. The wheels sat closer to Sarah's hands. Sarah was already sitting in it. What do you think? She asked. Annie set down her backpack. Can you move it? Sarah placed both hands against the wheel rims. Slowly she pushed. The chair rolled across the living room. Not far, maybe 6 feet, but Annie did not touch it. Sarah turned carefully and pushed again. Lauren walked beside her without helping. Annie's face changed. Mama, I know. Sarah moved another few feet, then stopped, tired but smiling. I did that. Annie nodded. You did. Richard stood near the kitchen doorway. Annie had not even noticed him when she entered. He said nothing. He understood that the moment had nothing to do with him. Annie walked to her mother and crouched beside the chair. Does your hip hurt? No. Back? No. Right foot? Annie. What? Just let me enjoy it. Annie laughed softly. All right. Sarah touched the wheel again. I haven't moved myself across this apartment in months. Annie lowered her eyes for a second, then looked at Richard. He gave a small nod. No cameras. No announcement. No one asking Sarah to thank anybody. Just a wheelchair that fit. Later, after Lauren left, Annie found Richard near the front door. The week isn't over, she said. What week? The van. I remember. I'm still only agreeing to 1 week. Richard put on his coat. All right. Annie narrowed her eyes. You agreed too fast. I'm learning. From who? He looked towards Sarah, who was practicing another slow turn in the new chair. Both of you. Annie followed his gaze. Sarah moved from one side of the living room to the other under her own power. For the first time, Annie did not step forward to help, and that may have been harder for her than pushing nearly 2 miles ever was. The new wheelchair changed the next morning in ways Annie had not expected. Sarah could roll herself from the bedroom to the kitchen without waiting for Annie. She could angle the chair beside the table, lock the brakes, and reach her coffee without asking for help. None of it looked dramatic, but Annie kept noticing each small movement. You're doing it again, Sarah said. Doing what? Watching me like I'm about to drive through the wall. I'm checking the brakes. You checked them twice. They're new. So is the chair. Let it live. Annie smiled and handed her the morning medication. At 5:20, Frank arrived as promised. The van ride to East Side took less than 20 minutes. Annie sat beside Sarah with her backpack on her lap, watching her mother occasionally touch the wheel rims as if confirming they were still there. At the rehabilitation center, Dr. Emily Harper inspected the chair before beginning therapy. "Whoever fitted this did good work," she said. Sarah turned slightly. "I can move it myself. I heard. 6 feet yesterday." 7, Annie corrected. Sarah looked at her. "You measured?" "I have eyes," Emily smiled. "Today we're going to see whether the better seat position helps when you stand." Sarah moved between the parallel bars. Emily adjusted her feet and asked Annie to stand several steps away. "Why over here?" Annie asked. "Because if you stand beside her, you'll try to catch her before she needs catching." "I don't do that." Both Sarah and Emily looked at her. Annie moved farther away. Sarah gripped the bars and pushed upward. Her arms worked hard, but the new chair had placed her feet in a better position before the transfer. 1, Emily counted. 2, 3. Sarah held. 4, 5, 6. Annie's fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. 7. Sarah lowered herself with Emily's help. A smile spread across her face. 7. Annie came forward. "That was good." "Just good?" "Very good." Sarah pointed toward Emily. "Write that down." She admitted it. Emily checked Sarah's right knee. 7 seconds after a hospital visit and a broken chair is progress. We build from there. Annie glanced at the clock. She still had enough time to reach school. That was another thing the van had changed. She no longer arrived after pushing for nearly an hour with sore shoulders and wet shoes. She could sit through first period without feeling as though the day had already used half of her strength. Frank dropped her near school before taking Sarah home. "See you tomorrow," he said. Annie paused beside the van. "Tomorrow's the last day." Frank looked at her. "Last day of what?" "The week Mr. Bennett arranged." "Oh, what?" "Nothing." That sounded like something. Frank smiled. "I drive the schedule dispatch gives me. You know something." "I know I have another pickup in 12 minutes. Annie narrowed her eyes. Sarah called from inside the van. "Go to school." Annie stepped away. "We're discussing this tomorrow." Frank lifted one hand. "I've survived worse." That afternoon, Annie returned home to find Richard sitting at the kitchen table with Sarah. There were papers between them. Annie stopped near the doorway. "What are those?" Sarah answered first. "Nothing bad." "That is never a useful answer." Richard turned one of the pages toward Annie. "Your mother received a call about follow-up testing." "I know. Next month." "Next week," Sarah corrected. Annie looked at her. "Why did they move it?" "The doctor had an opening." Annie picked up the paper. Then she saw another sheet beneath it. A prescription list. Another showed a transportation estimate. She looked at Richard. "What are you doing?" "Trying to understand what your mother's care actually requires." "We understand it." "Do you?" Annie's expression hardened. "Yes." Richard tapped the transportation estimate. "Then why were you planning to start pushing her again after tomorrow?" Sarah looked at Annie. "You were?" Annie kept her eyes on Richard. "My hands are better." "That isn't an answer." "It is my answer." Sarah moved her chair closer. "Annie, you said we'd figure something out." "We will." "When?" "Tomorrow." Richard rested his forearms on the table. "What happens tomorrow?" "The weekends." "And then?" "I take care of it." Sarah closed her eyes for a second. "There it is." Annie turned toward her. "What?" "That sentence. You say it every time there's a problem. Because problems don't disappear by discussing them." "No, but neither do you have to solve everyone alone." Annie placed the papers back on the table. "What do you want from me?" Richard answered quietly. "The truth." "You have it." "No, I have pieces." He pointed to the refrigerator. "Rent, heat, medication, food, transportation, school, work." Annie's face changed. "You looked at our bills?" "I saw what was already there." "That doesn't make them your business." "You're right." The answer stopped her. Richard continued. "They aren't my business unless you make them my business. But I need you to understand something before you decide to push your mother through snow again." Annie crossed her arms. "I'm listening." "Saving money by hurting yourself isn't free." She looked away. Richard let the words settle without adding more. Sarah reached for Annie's hand. "Honey, sit down. I have homework." 5 minutes. Annie remained standing. Sarah squeezed her fingers. Please. That changed it. Annie sat. Sarah looked at her daughter. How much did you make last week? Annie hesitated. Why? Answer me. Annie gave the number. Sarah asked. How much after missing that grocery shift? Annie gave a smaller one. And how much goes to rent? Annie did the math in her head. Richard did not speak. Sarah continued. Medicine? Another number. Heat? Annie's jaw tightened. Mama. No, you keep protecting me from numbers I already know. I'm handling it. You're surviving it. Annie pulled her hand away and stood. That's what people do. Richard looked at her. No. That's what people do when nobody gives them room to do anything else. She turned toward him. And what exactly are you offering? To pay everything. If that's what it takes for a while. Annie laughed once, without humor. No. Why? Because then what am I? Richard rose from the table. Still Annie. That's easy for you. Maybe. You pay the rent, the heat, the medicine, the rides, the chair, the hospital. Then one day you leave. What happens after that? Richard did not rush his answer. Then we make sure what I'm offering isn't a rescue that disappears. We make a plan. Annie looked at him. What plan? One that keeps your mother in therapy, keeps you in school, and keeps both of you from depending on whether I wake up feeling generous. That was the first thing he had said that reached past her fear. Sarah watched her carefully. Annie asked, And what do you get? Nothing. I don't believe that. Richard nodded. I know. Annie's eyes lowered to the papers. Richard added, So don't believe me yet. Watch what I do. Sarah touched the wheel rims and moved herself closer to the table. For tonight, she said, can we at least agree nobody is pushing me 2 miles tomorrow? Annie looked at her mother, then at Richard. 1 more week. Richard almost smiled. Transportation? 1 more week. New argument. And nothing else without asking me. Agreed. Annie pointed at him. I mean it. So do I. Sarah reached for the papers. Good. Now that the 2 of you have finished negotiating my life, somebody tell me what we're having for dinner. Annie looked toward the refrigerator. Soup. Sarah sighed. After everything I've survived? Richard picked up his coat. I know a diner. Annie gave him a warning look. He raised both hands. I was suggesting dinner, not buying the building. Sarah laughed. Annie tried not to, but she did. And for that evening, 1 more week was enough. The diner Richard mentioned turned out to be less than 10 minutes away. A narrow place with red vinyl booths, a long counter, and a coffee pot that seemed to refill itself before anyone asked. Annie recognized the kind of place immediately. It smelled of grilled onions, bacon, and pie crust. And the woman behind the register greeted Sarah with a warm, evening, ma'am, before directing them toward a table with enough space for the wheelchair. Richard pulled out a chair for Annie. She looked at him. You don't have to do that. I know. That seems to be your favorite answer. It's useful. Sarah rolled herself into place beside the table. I like him better when somebody else is feeding me. Annie removed her coat and sat. You like anybody who brings you near bacon. That is also true. Richard opened the menu, but Annie barely glanced at hers. He noticed. You've been here before? No. You already know what you want? The cheapest thing is grilled cheese. Richard lowered his menu. Order what you want. I want grilled cheese. Sarah looked at her daughter. You hate grilled cheese. I don't hate it. You picked the cheese off. That does not mean I hate it. Richard called the waitress over before Annie could continue. Sarah ordered meatloaf with mashed potatoes. Richard chose roast chicken. Annie asked for grilled cheese and water. The waitress wrote it down, then looked at Annie's bandaged hands. You want coffee, honey? Annie shook her head. No, ma'am, Sarah said. Bring her hot chocolate. Mama. Hot chocolate, Sarah repeated. The waitress smiled. Whipped cream? Sarah nodded. A lot. Annie gave up. Richard watched the exchange without interfering. A week earlier, he might have solved the whole evening by ordering too much food and paying before anyone could object. He was learning that Annie did not resist help because she enjoyed hardship. She resisted anything that made her feel as though decisions were being taken away from her. When the food arrived, Annie ate half the sandwich before realizing Richard had barely touched his meal. What? She asked. Nothing. You've been looking over here. I was thinking. That usually gets expensive. Sarah laughed into her water glass. Richard smiled. You're getting comfortable. No, I'm getting accurate. He took a bite of chicken. Fair. For a few minutes they ate without discussing hospital bills, vans, wheelchairs, rent, or therapy. Sarah complained that the meatloaf needed pepper. Annie told her she complained about everything. Richard admitted that he had not eaten in a diner like this in years. Sarah looked at his watch. I imagine your usual restaurants have tablecloths. Usually. Then you've been overpaying. I've suspected that. After dinner, Richard drove them home. Frank's accessible van had already been arranged for the next morning, so Michael helped Sarah from the SUV into her new chair, while Annie carried the takeout box containing half of Sarah's meatloaf. Inside the apartment, Annie placed it in the refrigerator. Richard remained near the door. I'll let you both get some rest. Annie turned. Wait. Sarah looked at her daughter. Annie wiped her palms against her jeans, then remembered the bandages and stopped. I need to ask you something. Richard nodded. Go ahead. Not here. Sarah immediately said. Why not? Because it's between me and him. Sarah crossed her arms. Annie gave her a look. Mama. Fine. I suddenly have no interest in anything happening in my own apartment. You're terrible at pretending. I know. Richard followed Annie into the hallway. She pulled the apartment door nearly closed behind them. For several seconds, Annie seemed unsure where to begin. Richard waited. Finally, she said, You told me you don't want anything back. That's right. And you said you're going to keep helping with Mom's transportation. If you agree. And the wheelchair. Yes. The hospital. Yes. She looked down the hallway. And you're talking about helping with the rest. Only if you and your mother want that. Annie nodded slowly. Then let me work for you. Richard's expression changed. What? I can work. I know you can. I mean for you. Your company. Annie, please hear me first. He stopped. She continued. I already work registers. I clean. I wash dishes. I can file papers. I can work in a warehouse. I can answer phones. I'll learn whatever I don't know. You're in school. After school, weekends, summer. What are you trying to do? Pay you back. I already told you. I know what you told me. Her voice tightened. But you don't understand what it feels like to have somebody suddenly paying for things you've spent months trying to keep together. Richard said nothing. Annie continued before she lost her nerve. I wake up knowing what I owe. Rent has a number. Heat has a number. Medicine has a number. Groceries have a number. I know how many hours I have to work for each one. She looked at him. But this doesn't have a number. You mean my help? Yes. And that scares you? It does. Richard nodded. At least you said it. Annie's eyes became wet, but she kept going. If I work for you, then it makes sense. You help my mother. I work. I earn it. Richard shook his head. No. Her face fell. I can do the work. I know. You haven't even seen me work. I've seen enough. That isn't fair. No. What isn't fair is taking an 18-year-old woman who is already working herself into the ground and telling her she has to earn her mother's medical care from me. Annie's voice dropped. I don't want charity. Richard stepped closer, but left space between them. Then don't call it charity. What am I supposed to call it? Help. That's easy for somebody with money. Yes, Richard said. It probably is. That stopped her. He continued. You've been working harder than most people I employ. That is exactly why I'm not turning this into another bill you have to pay. Annie blinked quickly. I don't like owing people. Then don't owe me. I don't know how. Richard looked at the bandages around her hands. Start by letting them heal. She laughed once, but tears reached her cheeks anyway. Embarrassed, she wiped them away. I'm serious. Soigny. She lowered her head. I just want to do something. You already are. What? You're keeping your mother going. You're finishing school. You're showing up. Annie shook her head. That doesn't pay you back. Richard answered softly. Maybe kindness isn't supposed to make somebody smaller just so the person giving it can feel bigger. Annie looked at him. He added, If someday you want to work for my company because you want the job, apply. I'll make sure you get an interview. But you will not work off your mother's wheelchair. You will not work off the hospital. And you will not owe me for stopping that car. The apartment door opened a few inches. Sarah's voice came through. I wasn't listening. Annie turned. Mama, I heard enough. Richard smiled. Sarah looked at her daughter. Come inside. Your hands need medicine. Annie wiped her face again. Richard started toward the stairs. Richard. He turned. It was the second time she had used his first name. Thank you. He gave her a small nod. This time, Annie did not add that she would repay him. She simply went back inside and closed the door. The next morning, Annie woke before the alarm and reached automatically for the clothes she normally wore on the walk to therapy. Then she remembered there would be no walk. For several seconds she sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the radiator click inside the wall. The apartment felt different when she did not have to measure the morning against nearly 2 miles of cold pavement. In the kitchen, Sarah was already awake. She had rolled herself to the table in the new wheelchair and was trying to open a packet of oatmeal. Annie stopped in the doorway. How did you get out here? Sarah looked up. I used the wheels. You should have called me. For oatmeal? For the transfer. I did it the way Emily showed me. By yourself? Sarah gave her a warning look. I am allowed to learn things when you aren't watching. Annie walked over and checked the wheelchair brakes. Sarah sighed. Good morning to you too. Morning. You want to check my pulse while you're here? Don't tempt me. Annie filled the kettle and glanced at the clock. Woederling Senfen. Normally. By now she would have already checked the weather twice. Wrapped the blanket around Sarah, inspected the tires, and calculated whether they needed to leave early because of snow. Instead, there was coffee brewing. A van would arrive in 17 minutes. Sarah watched her daughter move around the kitchen. You don't know what to do with yourself. I'm making breakfast. You've looked at that clock 4 times. 3. Four. Annie opened the refrigerator. There were eggs inside. Real eggs. Milk. Fresh fruit. A package of chicken. She stopped. Mama. Sarah took another sip of coffee. What? Where did this come from? Grocery delivery yesterday. From who? Sarah said nothing. Annie closed the refrigerator slowly. Richard. He called first. He called you? He asked. And you said yes? I said we needed groceries. Annie pressed both palms against the kitchen counter. Mama. Don't start. I'm not starting anything. You're using the voice you use right before you start something. Annie turned. We agreed he wasn't going to do things without asking. He asked me. He should have asked me. Sarah's expression sharpened. Why? Because I handle the groceries. That is exactly the problem. Annie shook her head. It's not a problem. Annie, I am still your mother. I know. Then stop acting like every decision in this apartment needs your approval. The words hit harder than Sarah intended. Annie looked away. Sarah's voice softened. I'm not saying you haven't done everything you could. Annie opened a cabinet and began taking out bowls. Sarah continued. I'm saying you've done so much that you forgot I can still decide some things. Annie stood with her back to her. I was trying to keep things together. I know. What was I supposed to do? Exactly what you did. Annie turned. Sarah reached toward her. But now somebody is offering us room to breathe. I want some of that room. Annie looked at her mother's hand, then took it. I just don't want us getting used to something that disappears. Then we don't get used to Richard. We get used to making better decisions while we have help. Before Annie could answer, headlights moved across the window. Frank had arrived. Sarah smiled. And right now, my better decision is not making my daughter push me through Cleveland before sunrise. Annie pulled the gray blanket across Sarah's legs. You still need this. Sarah touched Annie's coat. And you need a better one. This coat is fine. It looks tired. It has character. It has no insulation. Frank knocked. Annie opened the door. Morning. Morning, he said. Ready? Sarah rolled herself toward him. Frank raised his eyebrows. Look at you. New wheels. I see that. And I can move them myself. Annie pointed toward the service ramp. Don't encourage her too much. Sarah looked at Frank. She's having difficulty with my independence. I heard nothing. At East Side, Emily spent most of the session working on transfers. Sarah moved from the wheelchair to a padded bench with assistance, rested, then repeated the movement. By the third attempt, Annie stepped forward. Emily lifted one hand. Let her finish. She's losing her balance. She's correcting. Sarah shifted her left hand, adjusted her hips, and settled onto the bench. Annie stopped. Emily looked at her. See? Annie nodded. Sarah smiled. That hurt you more than it hurt me. Probably. Later, Sarah practiced standing. 6 seconds, then 7. On the final attempt, she reached 8. Annie's face changed at once. Sarah lowered herself into the chair. Was that 8? Emily checked the timer. 8. Sarah looked at Annie. Well? Annie smiled. That was really good. Better. Frank dropped Annie at school afterward. Before she got out, her phone rang. Richard, she answered. What did you buy? There was a pause. Good morning to you too. My refrigerator looks different. Your mother approved it. She told me. So why are you interrogating me? Because I'm keeping count. Of groceries? Of everything. Richard was quiet for a moment. Annie, are you free after school? I work at 4. Before that. Why? I'd like to talk to you and your mother about something. What kind of something? The kind where I ask before doing anything. She heard the smile in his voice. Fina, I'll come by at 3. After school, Richard arrived carrying no packages and making no phone calls. That helped. Sarah sat at the table. Annie remained near the counter. Richard placed a single sheet of paper between them. What is it? Annie asked. A short-term household assistance plan. Her expression closed immediately. Richard lifted a hand. Read it first. Annie did. 3 months of rent assistance. Heating bill support through the end of winter. Transportation to rehabilitation. Prescription costs not covered by insurance. Nothing permanent. Nothing hidden. No repayment clause. No publicity. No obligation to work for Richard or his company. Annie read the page again. 3 months. Yes. Why 3? Because forever would make you feel trapped, and 1 week doesn't solve anything. Sarah looked at him. You've been paying attention. I'm trying. Annie tapped the paper. And after 3 months, we sit down again. If you don't need help, it stops. If you need a different plan, we discuss it. No decisions without us? None. You're putting that in writing? Richard pointed to the bottom of the page. It already is. Annie looked at her mother. Sarah said, I want to accept it. Annie read the page one last time. Then she picked up a pen. Richard expected her to sign. Instead, she added a sentence beneath the final paragraph. Any changes must be discussed with both Sarah Carter and Annie Carter first. She slid the paper toward Richard. You sign that too. Richard read it, then smiled. Deal. He signed. That night, Annie came home from the grocery store shortly after 10. Sarah was already asleep. The apartment was warm. The refrigerator had food in it. The rent envelope on the counter no longer needed the money Annie had planned to put inside. She stood there with her paycheck in one hand and realized she did not have to calculate which bill would lose this week. For once, there was nothing she needed to solve before morning. Annie went to bed without setting the alarm for 4:30. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept until daylight. Richard returned 2 evenings later without a driver waiting at the curb. He parked his own sedan beside the building and carried nothing inside. Annie noticed that first. No groceries? No. No paperwork? No. No mysterious equipment arriving in 10 minutes? Richard smiled. I'm improving. Sarah rolled her wheelchair away from the kitchen table to make space. Coffee? If you're having some. Annie opened the cabinet. He knows where the coffee is now. That sounds dangerous, Sarah said. Richard removed his coat and sat, while Annie poured 3 cups. There was something different about the visit. He had not come to solve a transportation problem or sign a bill. He had called earlier and simply asked whether he could stop by. Sarah added sugar to her coffee. So what brings a billionaire to our kitchen without an agenda? Richard looked at the cup between his hands. I owe Annie an explanation. Annie sat across from him. I thought you said I didn't owe you anything. You don't. Then why do you owe me? Because you've asked why I'm doing all this, and I've never really answered. Sarah glanced at Annie but did not interrupt. Richard turned the cup once on the table. My wife died 6 years ago. Annie's expression softened. I'm sorry. Thank you. He paused before continuing. We were married 23 years. I loved her. I want that part understood before anything else. Annie nodded. But I spent most of those years working as if love could wait until my calendar had room for it. Sarah lowered her coffee. Richard continued without dramatizing the words. I provided well. Houses, insurance, vacations, anything money could handle. If something broke, I replaced it. If there was a bill, I paid it. If she wanted something, I could usually get it. What couldn't you get? Annie asked. Time back. She said nothing. Richard looked toward the kitchen window. My wife would ask me to come home for dinner. I'd tell her I had a meeting. She'd ask me to take a weekend away. I'd say next month. Sometimes I sent flowers because I missed something important. Sarah gave him a sympathetic look. You thought providing was the same as being present. For a long time. And your daughter? Annie asked. Richard looked at her. She lives in North Carolina now. Are you close? We speak. Annie understood the difference immediately. How often? Birthday. Holidays. Occasionally when one of us decides too much time has passed. That doesn't sound close. No. Richard did not defend himself. She didn't cut me out of her life. Nothing dramatic happened. That almost makes it worse. We just became two people who know how to be polite with each other. Sarah ran one hand along the wheel rim. You can still call her. I know. Do you? Richard gave a faint smile. That's why I'm here. Annie looked confused. What does your daughter have to do with us? Richard met her eyes. The first morning I noticed you. I was sitting in a heated SUV reading a financial report. Annie waited. I saw you pushing your mother. I wondered where you were going. The light changed, and I went back to work. That happened more than once? Yes. How many? I don't know. Annie looked down at her coffee. Richard continued. Enough that I should have asked myself why the same two women were making that trip before sunrise in freezing weather. Sarah said quietly. But you didn't. No. Why? Richard considered the question. Because I assumed somebody else had it handled. Transportation services, social programs, family, a church, the city, anyone except me. Annie looked at him again. I wasn't asking you to stop. I know. Then you didn't do anything wrong. I'm not sure I agree. She frowned slightly. Richard nodded toward Sarah's gray blanket folded over the back of her wheelchair. I kept seeing that blanket. Annie glanced at it. Your mother was wrapped in the warmest thing you had, and you were walking behind her in a coat that barely kept the wind out. Sarah looked at her daughter. Richard continued. You had almost nothing to spare, Annie, but every morning you gave her the warm part. Annie shifted in her chair. She needed it more. That's exactly the point. Richard rested his forearms on the table. I spent years believing care meant making sure people had things. You showed me a different version. I didn't show you anything. I was just taking Mom to therapy. You were showing up. The sentence made Annie look at him. Every morning, when it was cold, when you were tired, when you had school, when you had work, you were there. Sarah's eyes moved toward Richard. He continued. I gave people I loved expensive things and told myself that counted when I wasn't there. You had no expensive things to give your mother, so you gave her your time, your hands, your strength. Annie looked uncomfortable with the praise. I didn't have a choice. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. You could have stopped trying. She shook her head immediately. No. Richard nodded. Exactly. For a moment, Annie focused on the steam rising from her coffee. Then she asked, so when you saw the chair broken, I finally saw what I had been driving past. You stopped because you felt guilty? Richard did not hide from the question. Partly, Sarah watched him closely, and partly because I remembered something I should never have forgotten. What? That being useful isn't the same as being successful. Annie considered that. Richard looked at her. You thought I stopped because you needed help. She waited. I stopped because I needed to remember what mattered. Sarah reached for her coffee, but Annie remained focused on Richard. So helping us makes you feel better? The question was direct. Richard respected it. Sometimes. Annie's expression tightened. But that isn't why I keep coming back, he added. Then why? Because if I only helped until my guilt felt better, this would still be about me. Sarah nodded once. Richard continued. Your mother needs reliable transportation. You need enough room in your life to finish school without calculating whether missing one shift means losing heat. Those things remain true whether I feel good about helping or not. Annie rested her hands around her cup. That makes more sense. Good. It still makes me uncomfortable. I know. Sarah smiled. There she is. Annie looked at her. What? The girl who thinks accepting anything means surrendering control. I signed his agreement. After editing it. It needed improvement. Richard smiled. She was right. Sarah pointed toward him. Do not encourage her. Annie laughed. Richard's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen. His daughter's name appeared. He did not answer immediately. Annie noticed. That her? Yes. Then why are you sitting here? Richard picked up the phone. Sarah lifted her cup. Take it. He stood and walked toward the hallway, then stopped before stepping out. I called her yesterday. Annie smiled. And? She didn't answer. The phone continued vibrating in his hand. Annie nodded toward it. She is now. Richard looked at the screen once more and answered. Hey. He listened. A small change crossed his face. Yeah, I have time. He stepped into the hallway. Annie watched the door close behind him. Sarah reached across the table and touched her daughter's hand. You know what you did? Annie shook her head. I pushed a wheelchair. Sarah smiled. No. You made a man who owns half the city pick up the phone when his family called. Annie looked toward the hallway. For once, Richard Bennett was not solving a problem with money. He was simply making himself available. By the time the last dirty piles of snow disappeared from the curbs, Annie had stopped counting how many mornings Frank's van arrived on time. At first, she had treated every ride like something temporary. She watched the clock, checked every strap, remembered exactly how many days Richard had paid for, and waited for the arrangement to end. It never ended without discussion. At the end of the 3-month assistance plan, Richard sat with Annie and Sarah at the kitchen table, just as he had promised. They went through every expense together. Sarah's transportation remained covered. Her prescriptions were manageable. Annie had returned to regular shifts at the grocery store, but she no longer accepted every extra hour someone offered. That was harder than she expected. On a Thursday evening, her manager held up a clipboard. Carla called out Saturday. You want the shift? Annie opened her mouth automatically. Then she thought about the chemistry review packet in her backpack. No, sir. Her manager looked surprised. You sure? Annie almost changed her answer. Yes. Walking away felt irresponsible. 2 months earlier, she would have calculated what 6 extra hours could buy. Now she went home, ate dinner with Sarah, and spent Saturday morning studying at the kitchen table. Nothing terrible happened because she rested. That lesson took longer to accept than any help Richard had offered. Sarah's progress came more slowly. Some mornings, she stood for 10 seconds. On others, her right leg refused to cooperate, and Emily ended the session early. There were days when Sarah left East Side smiling, and days when she reached the van frustrated enough to refuse conversation. Emily never tried to make either kind of day mean more than it did. Recovery isn't a staircase, she told Sarah one morning. You don't go up 1 step every day. Sarah adjusted her hands on the parallel bars. Then whoever designed it did a poor job. I'll file a complaint. With management. I am management in here. Annie sat nearby with a notebook open on her lap. She had been studying vocabulary for an English exam while Sarah worked. Emily moved behind Sarah and adjusted the support belt around her waist. Today we're trying something different. Annie looked up. Sarah did too. What kind of different? Emily nodded toward the space between the bars. 1 step. Sarah's expression changed. Annie closed the notebook. Emily immediately pointed at her. You stay there. I didn't move. You were about to. I was turning a page. You closed the book. Sarah smiled. She has you figured out. Annie folded her arms. Fine. Emily turned back to Sarah. Your left leg has been taking weight well. Your right is weaker. But you've been controlling the knee better. I want you to shift your weight. Move the left foot forward. Then stop. Sarah gripped the bars. What if I can't? Then we learn something and try another day. What if I can? Emily smiled. Then you took a step. Sarah looked toward Annie. Annie's face had already become serious. Mama, don't worry about me. I'm not worried about you. You're checking my face. I gave birth to that face. I can check it. Emily stepped closer. Ready? Sarah nodded. She pushed upward. Her arms tightened against the bars as her legs took the weight. Emily supported her hips but did not lift her. Hold, Emily said. Sarah steadied herself. Now shift left to right just a little. Sarah moved carefully. Her right knee shook. Annie's hands tightened around the closed notebook, but she stayed in the chair. Good, Emily said. Now the left foot. Sarah moved it forward. Only a few inches. The sole touched the floor. She stopped. Annie covered her mouth. Sarah looked down. I did that? You did, Emily said. Sarah's eyes filled, but she laughed instead. That barely counts. It counts. Annie stood this time. Emily did not stop her. Sarah looked toward her daughter. 1. Annie nodded. 1. Emily waited until Sarah was ready. Want to sit? Sarah looked down the short distance between her feet. No. All right. She shifted again. The second movement took longer. Her right leg trembled hard enough that Emily moved closer, but Sarah held the bars and brought her right foot forward. It landed beside the left. 2, Emily said. Sarah lowered herself into the wheelchair with assistance. Annie reached her before Emily had removed the support belt. Mama. Sarah wiped at her cheek. Don't start crying. I'm not. You are. So are you. Sarah touched Annie's face. You always were a terrible liar. Annie laughed through the tears. There was no cheering from the hallway. No miracle. Sarah had moved less than 2 feet and needed the wheelchair immediately afterward. But those 2 steps had come from months of work that once required Annie to push her through winter before dawn. Now Sarah had moved herself. That afternoon, Annie went to Richard's office downtown. She had been there only once before, and the scale of the building still made her uncomfortable. Security knew her name, but she refused the employee who offered to escort her upstairs. I know where I'm going. Richard's assistant showed her into his office. Richard looked up from his desk. You're supposed to be celebrating. Mom took 2 steps. I heard. How? Your mother called me. Annie shook her head. She tells you everything. Mostly things you don't want her to tell me. That sounds right. Richard noticed the folder in her hand. What's that? Annie placed it on his desk. My application. He opened it. Bennett Logistics and Properties Summer Employment Program. Richard looked up. You're serious. I told you I wanted to work. I remember. And you told me if I wanted a job for the right reason, I could apply. I did. So I applied. Richard read the first page. You put warehouse operations as your first choice. I know grocery inventory. I know receiving. I know how to work a scanner. I can learn the rest. And administrative services second. I can use a computer. I never doubted that. She pointed toward the application. I don't want you giving me the job. I know. I mean it. No phone call telling somebody to hire me. Richard leaned back. You want me to stay out of it? I want an interview. With whoever interviews everyone else? Yes. And if they say no? Annie hesitated. Then they say no. Richard smiled. That might be the hardest thing you've agreed to since I met you. Don't enjoy it too much. He closed the folder. I'll send it to Human Resources. Nothing else. Annie extended her hand. Richard looked at it. Her fingers were healed now. No gauze, no split skin. He shook her hand. Deal. As Annie reached the door, Richard called after her. Annie. She turned. Whatever happens with the interview, your mother's care isn't connected to it. I know. Good. She opened the door, then looked back. And Richard? Yes? If they hire me. I'm not getting coffee for everybody. He smiled. Then I suggest you interview well. 3 weeks later, Annie did. She earned the summer position in warehouse operations on her own. When the acceptance email arrived, Sarah read it twice before handing the phone back. You got it. Annie smiled. I got it. Sarah touched the wheels of her chair. That spring, both women were learning the same thing in different ways. A door opening for you did not mean someone else had carried you through it. Sometimes it only meant that, after fighting long enough to reach the entrance, you were finally given the chance to move forward under your own strength. Graduation morning arrived warm enough that Annie left her winter coat hanging by the door. Sarah noticed before anything else. You're really going without it? It's 70 degrees outside. I know. I just wanted to hear you admit that weather can improve. Annie turned from the hallway mirror and adjusted the blue graduation gown over her shoulders. The cap sat slightly crooked. Sarah rolled closer. Come here. I already fixed it. You made it worse. Annie bent down while Sarah straightened the cap and moved the tassel away from her face. There. How do I look? Sarah took her time, like somebody who needs to stop moving so her mother can look at her. Annie smiled, but Sarah's expression made her stop. For months, the kitchen table had held medical papers, utility notices, work schedules, school assignments, and transportation forms. That morning it held a graduation program, 2 cups of coffee, and a grocery store sheet cake Mr. Collins had insisted Annie take home the night before. Sarah reached for Annie's hand. The skin across her knuckles had healed. No tape. No gauze. No cracks from cold air and dishwater. Sarah turned the hand over gently. These are the same hands. Annie knew what she meant. Mama, I remember what they looked like that morning. Today is supposed to be a good day. It is. Sarah squeezed her fingers. That's why I remember. Annie looked down at their joined hands. Months earlier, those fingers had struggled to hold a broken wheelchair together beside a frozen road. Now one of them wore a small class ring she had bought with money from her first paycheck at Bennett Logistics. Sarah released her. "Get your shoes. We're going to be late." Annie raised an eyebrow. "You spent 10 minutes fixing my cap, and I used everyone wisely." Frank arrived at 8:30, although Sarah's regular therapy ride was not scheduled that day. Richard had asked whether the transportation company could take them to graduation, and this time Annie had agreed without negotiating a 1-week limit. Frank lowered the ramp. "Well, look at you." Annie stepped toward the van. "Don't make this emotional. I was going to say the gown is wrinkled." She looked down immediately. Frank laughed. "Got you." Sarah rolled past him. "She has been checking that gown since 6. Mama, I'm giving him context. The school parking lot was already filling when they arrived. Families carried flowers, balloons, folding umbrellas, and cameras. Teachers directed people toward the auditorium while graduates gathered near a side entrance. Annie kept one hand near Sarah's wheelchair as they moved through the crowd, though Sarah propelled herself most of the way. At the auditorium doors, Annie stopped. "You're in the front section." "I know. Someone will help if you need anything." "I know. My phone will be off." "Annie." "What?" Sarah pointed toward the line of graduates forming behind her. "Go graduate." Annie laughed and bent to kiss her cheek. "I'll see you after." "You better." Sarah watched her join the others. A few minutes later, someone took the seat beside her. Richard Bennett wore a dark suit without a tie. Sarah looked at him. "You're late." "I'm 3 minutes early. In my generation, that's late." "I'll work on it." She glanced at the empty rows behind them. "You could sit closer." "I'm close enough." Sarah understood why he had chosen a seat several rows back from the stage instead of taking the place offered to him near the school administrators. No company photographer had come with him. No assistant. No announcement that a billionaire was attending. He had arrived because Annie was graduating. Nothing more needed to be made of it. Mr. Collins from the grocery store sat across the aisle with his wife. 2 employees from the diner were farther back, one holding a small bouquet wrapped in supermarket paper. Richard noticed them. "She invited everybody." Sarah smiled. They invited themselves. The ceremony began with the principal asking families to silence their phones. There were speeches about opportunity, responsibility, and the uncertain road ahead. Annie stood in line with her class near the side of the stage. From where Sarah sat, she could see Annie flex her fingers once. It was a habit she had kept from Winter. Sarah's eyes dropped to her own hands on the wheel rims. Then the names began, one after another. Applause rose and settled. When the announcer reached the C's, Sarah sat straighter. "Annie Carter." Annie crossed the stage. For a few seconds, Sarah saw far more than the young woman in a blue gown. She saw hands wrapped around wheelchair handles before sunrise, hands counting grocery money at the kitchen table, hands washing dishes after long school days, hands pulling a gray blanket higher around her mother's shoulders, hands covered in white hospital bandages. Now those same hands reached forward and accepted a diploma. Sarah clapped until her palms hurt. "That's my girl." Several people nearby laughed and applauded harder. Annie heard her. She turned her head toward the audience and found Sarah almost immediately. Her smile widened. Then she noticed Richard several rows behind. He did not wave or stand. He simply applauded. Annie gave him a small nod before continuing across the stage. After the ceremony, the parking lot filled with families taking pictures. Sarah insisted on one photograph of Annie alone before allowing herself into the next. "Stand straight," she said. "I am standing straight. You're leaning. I spent years pushing a wheelchair. My shoulders have opinions." Sarah tried to hide a smile. Mr. Collins came over and handed Annie an envelope. "What's this?" "Card from the store." "You didn't have to. Open it later." One of the diner waitresses hugged her. "Look at you. Graduate and everything. I was hoping they'd let me out eventually." Richard waited until the others had finished before approaching. Annie looked at him. "No giant check?" "Left it in the helicopter." Sarah laughed. Annie shook her head. "You're getting worse. I've been spending too much time around your mother." Richard handed her a small envelope. Annie's expression changed. "What is this?" "Not money." She opened it. Inside was a printed copy of her summer employment confirmation from Bennett Logistics and Properties. Across the bottom, Richard had written only one sentence. "You earned your seat at the table. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Annie read it twice. "You could have texted me this." I'm 50. We established that I'm old-fashioned. She folded the paper carefully and put it back inside. Thank you. Richard nodded. Sarah watched them, then looked toward the gray blanket folded over the back of her wheelchair even though the day was warm. That winter had taught all three of them something different. Sarah had learned that needing help did not erase independence. Richard had learned that providing was not the same as showing up. And Annie was still learning the hardest lesson of all. Strength was not measured by how much pain a person could carry without asking anyone to notice. Sometimes strength was graduating. Sometimes it was resting. Sometimes it was accepting an open door and walking through it under your own name. Annie slipped the diploma beneath her arm and placed one hand on Sarah's wheelchair. Sarah immediately looked up. I can move myself. I know. Then why are you pushing? Annie smiled. Because today I want to. Sarah considered that, then rested her hands in her lap. All right. Together they moved toward the parking lot, where Frank was waiting beside the van and Richard walked a few steps behind them. This time Annie's hands were not pushing because there was no other choice. They were pushing because she finally had one. A few weeks after graduation, the morning air had finally lost its winter bite. Annie opened the apartment door and stepped aside while Sarah rolled toward the hallway. The gray blanket was folded across the back of the wheelchair out of habit, though neither of them needed it. Outside, sunlight touched the brick buildings across the street. The last dirty piles of snow were gone, and the service ramp behind the building had dried enough that Annie no longer had to check it for ice before Sarah used it. Frank's van waited near the curb. He lowered the ramp when he saw them. Morning, ladies. Sarah lifted a hand. Morning, Frank. Annie checked the time. You're early. 30 seconds. I noticed. Frank smiled. Some things never change. Sarah rolled toward the ramp, then stopped. Wait. Annie moved beside her. What's wrong? Nothing. Sarah locked the wheelchair brakes. Annie knew that sound well now. Mama? Sarah reached down and moved the footrests aside. Annie understood. No. Sarah looked up. No? You're not doing this on the sidewalk. I've done it inside. With Emily next to you. I have the walker. That is not the same thing. Sarah pointed toward the van. Frank is right there. Frank immediately raised both hands. I have no position in this argument. Annie ignored him. Mama, you can practice at therapy. Sarah reached for the walker folded beside the chair. No. Annie blinked. You're telling me no now? I learned from the best. Sarah opened the walker and positioned it in front of herself. Annie stepped closer. Sarah noticed. Don't. I'm not doing anything. You're getting ready to catch me. That seems reasonable. I need you to let me try. Annie's hands stayed near her sides. That was harder than moving forward. Sarah placed both palms on the walker handles. She shifted toward the front edge of the wheelchair and set her feet carefully against the pavement. Annie watched the right leg. It was still weaker. It always would be. Sarah pushed upward. Her arms tightened first. Then her legs took part of the weight. She reached standing. Annie moved half a step closer. Sarah gave her a look. Annie stopped. All right. Sarah adjusted her grip. Frank remained near the van in case she needed assistance, but he did not interfere. Sarah moved the walker forward a few inches. Then her left foot. One step. Her right knee trembled. Annie's fingers curled against her palms. Sarah shifted her weight and brought the right foot forward. Tfu. She stopped there, not because she had failed, because she knew her limit. Sarah smiled. Tfu. Annie nodded, fighting tears. Tfu. Without Emily, Frank was here. Frank pointed toward himself. I contributed nothing. Sarah laughed and lowered herself carefully into the wheelchair with Annie supporting her only when she asked. Once Sarah was seated, Annie crouched beside her. How does your leg feel? Tired. Hip? Fine. Back? Sarah sighed. There she is. I'm asking. And I'm answering. I'm fine. Annie touched her mother's hand. You scared me. I took 2 steps. Exactly. Sarah looked at her daughter for a moment, then reached behind the chair and pulled the gray blanket free. Annie frowned. You're not cold. I know. Sarah unfolded it. For months Annie had wrapped that blanket around her mother before dawn, making sure every corner covered Sarah's legs while leaving herself with whatever protection her thin coat could give. Now Sarah reached up and placed the blanket around Annie's shoulders. Annie froze. Mama. Sarah pulled one side across her chest. Your turn to stay warm now. Annie looked down at the faded fabric. It's 65 degrees. I know. Then this makes no sense. It makes perfect sense to me. Annie laughed through the tears that finally came. Sarah touched her cheek. You spent a long time thinking loving me meant freezing beside me. I didn't think that. You lived like it. Annie lowered herself onto the edge of the ramp beside her. Sarah continued. You don't have to hurt to prove you love somebody. Annie looked toward the street. I'm still learning that. Suing I. Frank cleared his throat from beside the van. I hate to interrupt, but Eastside has a schedule. Annie wiped her face. Sarah looked at him. You waited months to start caring about schedules? I've been corrupted. They laughed, and Frank helped guide Sarah onto the van. Annie climbed in beside her, still wearing the blanket. She kept it there for the entire ride. Months passed. Sarah continued therapy. Some weeks brought improvement. Others brought soreness and frustration. She still used the wheelchair for daily mobility, but she could transfer more safely, stand with support, and take short, assisted steps when her strength allowed. Annie started her summer position at Bennett Logistics and Properties. Richard kept his promise. She received no special title and no private office. Her first weeks were spent learning inventory systems, shipment records, warehouse safety procedures, and receiving schedules. She loved it, not because Richard owned the company, because when her supervisor handed her work, it was work she had earned. One afternoon near the end of summer, Richard found her reviewing a shipment discrepancy. You look busy. I am. Good. Annie looked up. Was there something you needed? That depends. She waited. Richard placed a folder on the desk. Annie immediately became suspicious. What is that? Something I want your opinion on. She opened it. Inside was a proposal for a new transportation assistance program funded through one of Richard's charitable foundations. Wheelchair repairs, proper mobility equipment, accessible rides to rehabilitation, emergency transportation during severe weather, support for families who could not afford regular service. Annie read several pages before looking up. You're really doing this? Yes. For how many people? As many as the fund can responsibly support. She turned another page, then stopped. Printed across the top was the proposed name. The Annie Project. She looked at Richard. No. I expected that. You cannot name this after me. Why not? Because we agreed no publicity. This isn't an advertisement. My name is on it. Richard nodded. I never said no legacy. Annie tried to stay annoyed. It did not work. You planned that line. For weeks. That makes it worse. Richard smiled. Annie looked down at the proposal again. What if somebody needs help and doesn't know how to ask? Then we design the program so asking isn't humiliating. She nodded slowly. And nobody has to perform gratitude? No. No cameras showing people crying beside giant checks? Absolutely not. No making people feel like they owe the foundation? Richard shook his head. Annie closed the folder. Then I have suggestions. I was counting on that. A year earlier, Richard Bennett had believed money could solve almost anything worth solving. Annie Carter had believed strength meant carrying every burden herself. Sarah had believed needing help meant becoming a burden. All three had been wrong. The wheelchair still existed. The illness still existed. Bills still arrived. Hard days still came. What changed was that none of them confused hardship with virtue anymore. And somewhere in Cleveland, another person would eventually receive a safe wheelchair, a heated ride, or a way to reach therapy because one winter morning a man in a passing car had finally chosen to stop. Not every act of kindness changes the world, but sometimes it changes what happens to the next person standing in the same cold. This story reminds us that real strength is not measured by how much pain we can carry alone. Annie's love for her mother was powerful, but it became healthier when she learned that accepting sincere help did not make her weak or less independent. Richard learned something just as important. Money can solve problems, but it cannot replace presence, compassion, and the courage to notice someone who is struggling. The deeper lesson is simple: kindness should protect a person's dignity, not make them feel small. And sometimes the most meaningful change begins when one person chooses to stop, listen, and help without asking for anything in return. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.